Most people think the next great financial problem will arrive wearing a loud costume. They think it will come from some obvious villain, an AI bubble, a trade war, a political circus in Washington, a recession headline with dramatic music behind it. That is how people are trained to think. They look for the loud threat. They stare at the bright object. They wait for the crisis that already sounds like a crisis. I have lived too long to trust that instinct. The great financial dangers are often much quieter. They begin in places the public does not watch because the public has never been taught to care. They begin in funding markets, in collateral chains, in yield relationships, in buyer behavior, in the places where money changes shape before it changes headlines. That is where I would tell any serious investor to look. Now, because if you are wondering why mortgage rates refuse to fall the way they are supposed to, why stocks seem stable for months and then suddenly behave like a frightened animal, why the Federal Reserve can talk about easing while financial conditions still feel stubbornly tight, you will not find the full answer in Washington. You will find a large part of the answer in Tokyo, and more specifically in the most boring thing in the world, Japanese government bonds. That sentence does not sound like the opening of a great wealth story or a great crisis story. That is one reason it matters so much. The public likes drama. Markets are often moved by plumbing, and for more than 30 years, a very large piece of global financial plumbing has run through Japan. The average American does not think about that. He thinks Japan makes cars, game consoles, cameras, cartoons, and highly disciplined workers who bow more than we do. He does not think of Japan as a silent engine of global liquidity. He should, because for decades, Japan has been doing something the world became dangerously accustomed to. It has been exporting cheap money. When the world gets used to cheap money long enough, it stops seeing it as an unusual gift and starts seeing it as part of the natural landscape. That is, when risk increases, I want to explain why, and I want to explain it the way I would explain it to myself if I were beginning again from scratch, with no time for jargon and no patience for financial theater. You have to go back to the early 1990s. That is where the real story begins. Japan did not stumble into this role because it wanted to become the world's funding currency. It was pushed there by failure. Its asset bubble burst. Real estate collapsed. Equities collapsed. Confidence collapsed. And what followed was one of the longest economic hangs in the modern developed world. The phrase people use is the lost decades. That phrase sounds poetic. It was not poetic if you lived inside it. It meant an economy with weak growth, weak wage expansion, weak animal spirits, and perhaps most importantly, weak inflation. An economy does not have to implode spectacularly to become dangerous. It can simply stop inspiring motion. That was Japan, a giant developed nation living inside economic low gravity. When a central bank faces that kind of world, it starts exhausting the normal playbook quickly. The Bank of Japan cut rates, then it cut them to almost nothing. Then it pushed them below zero. And when even that failed to create a satisfying escape velocity, it moved into the sort of policy language that only central bankers and very tired bond traders pretend to love. Yield curve control. The phrase sounds technical enough that ordinary people immediately tune out. That is unfortunate because the idea is actually simple. The Bank of Japan effectively said that long-term government bond yields would not be allowed to rise much, regardless of what the market felt about it. If the market wanted higher yields, the central bank would stand there and cap them. That is what yield curve control really means. Not elegant theory price suppression in the name of stability for years. Japanese government bonds yielded almost nothing. That had enormous consequences. A low yield on domestic government debt is not only a macroeconomic curiosity, it is a practical problem for every large institution that must earn a return. A Japanese insurer still needs yield. A pension fund still needs yield. A bank still needs yield. A wealthy individual still needs yield. If the domestic bond market offers next to nothing, those institutions face an unpleasant choice. They can accept starvation at home, or they can look elsewhere. For decades, they looked elsewhere. That is one of the most important facts in global finance, and also one of the least appreciated by ordinary investors. Japan became one of the world's great exporters of capital, not because it was in a generous mood, but because the math kept forcing money out. The local return was too low, the global return was higher. And once money learns that one side of the world will lend it nearly free and another side of the world will pay it much better, a machine begins to form. That machine became known as the yen carry trade. Again, the phrase sounds more exotic than the underlying reality. Borrow cheaply in yen, convert the proceeds into dollars or some other currency. Buy higher yielding assets abroad, pocket the spread after expenses if you can. That is the skeleton of it. What matters is not the elegance of the trade. What matters is the scale. If the borrowing cost in yen is near zero and a U.S. Treasury yields 4%, the spread looks attractive. If agency mortgage-backed securities yield more, they look attractive too. If corporate bonds yield more, if technology stocks promise growth, if real estate looks strong, if emerging markets seem to offer even richer opportunity, then capital starts flowing outward into all of it. This is where the ordinary person begins missing the plot. He hears carry trade and thinks some specialized hedge fund trick. He imagines a few men in a tower looking at screens. What he should imagine instead is a vast invisible subsidy to global asset prices when the world's cheapest funding source can be borrowed in size and turned into demand for higher yielding assets elsewhere. It affects much more than the bond market. It affects mortgage rates. It affects risk appetite. It affects equities. It affects private credit. It affects real estate. It affects the entire emotional tone of markets, because liquidity is not just money. It is the oxygen that lets people feel comfortable paying high prices for future things. If you want a simpler picture, think of a man I will call Bob. Bob can borrow in yen at almost no cost. He does not do that because he loves Japan. He does it because his own capital is always looking for the easiest and cheapest route to a spread. He converts into dollars. He buys us treasuries or maybe mortgage-backed securities, or maybe he extends out the risk curve and buys something that feels only slightly more aggressive because the world has been taught for years that money is cheap and central banks are gentle. Bob is not unusual. The important thing is that there are many Bobs. Some are insurers, some are pension managers, some are banks, some are hedge funds, some are giant institutions that do not think of themselves as dramatic at all. Together they create demand. Demand matters, particularly in the long end of the Treasury market, and now we arrive at a point many people do not understand, which is one reason the subject remains underappreciated. The Federal Reserve controls short-term rates directly. It has enormous influence. Yes, it can set the overnight policy rate, it can shape expectations, it can nudge the front end of the curve. But the 10-year, the 20-year, the 30-year, those yields are not controlled by Jerome Powell the way people on television often speak as though they were. Those maturities are shaped by buyers and sellers, by issuance and demand, by inflation expectations, term premium, and global capital flows. That is where Japan comes back into the picture. For years, Japan was not merely another buyer of U.S. debt. It was one of the most consistent, price-insensitive, structurally motivated buyers in the world. That is a much more powerful role than casual observers realize. Price-sensitive buyers can disappear quickly. A structurally motivated buyer keeps showing up because his domestic alternatives remain awful. Japan kept showing up because for a long time the domestic setup forced it to. That gave the world a kind of hidden support beam. Treasuries had a major foreign bid. Mortgage markets had a major foreign bid. Risk assets benefited indirectly because low long-term yields changed the valuation math of almost everything. People say the bond market is boring. That is because they do not understand that the bond market is the baseline from which the rest of the market takes its emotional and mathematical bearings. A stock is not valued in a vacuum. A house is not financed in a vacuum. A business does not borrow in a vacuum. Everything gets priced relative to some idea of the risk, free rate, and the cost of capital. If long yields are low, many assets can look more attractive. if long yields stay high or rise. The entire world feels tighter even when the headlines pretend policy is easing. That is why I keep telling people to stop staring only at the front end. The Fed is important, is not omnipotent, and then came the change. This is where a long, stable arrangement began to wobble. The Bank of Japan started moving away from the emergency framework it had maintained for years. Yield curve control ended, rates were raised, then raised again, and suddenly a market that had built whole structures on the assumption that yen funding would remain absurdly cheap forever had to look in the mirror and admit something it did not want to admit: forever had ended. That is always an uncomfortable moment in finance. The whole carry trade worked because the cost of borrowing in yen was negligible enough, reliable enough, and psychologically trusted enough that huge amounts of capital could sit on top of it. The moment Japanese yields move upward and hedging costs become more expensive, the lovely math begins to look less lovely. The free lunch starts presenting a bill, and when the bill appears, capital behaves the way capital always behaves: it reconsiders. If domestic Japanese yields become more attractive, then the incentive to keep sending so much money abroad weakens. If hedging foreign exposure becomes more costly, the net return weakens again. If the spread narrows enough, the whole exercise starts losing its emotional charm. That is when repatriation enters the story. Repatriation sounds mild. It is not mild when large amounts of global capital have spent decades living in the wrong place for yield. Reasons repatriation means the money that had been flowing outward begins coming home. And that is a serious issue for a world that became used to Japan acting like a permanent source of cheap external funding. When that source becomes less cheap, or even domestically attractive, the entire chain of global demand can shift. People like to think markets are powered mainly by narratives. They are often powered by funding conditions wearing narrative clothing. Japan's role in global markets has been exactly that. A funding condition disguised as background scenery. The moment the background changes, the foreground starts moving in ways that confuse those who were only watching the pretty objects. This is why you can have a Federal Reserve that sounds dovish and still get financial conditions that refuse to become loose in the way everyone expects. Because long rates may not cooperate, because mortgage rates are not controlled by Powell's mood alone, because Treasury issuance is enormous. Because the U.S. government keeps running deficits of such scale that the long end constantly needs buyers, and because if one of the most important foreign buyers becomes less motivated or begins returning capital home, someone else must absorb the debt. If that someone else demands a higher yield, the yield goes up. That is how markets work when the bond market still matters. And it always matters. I have listened for years to people talk as though one rate cut solves the world. That is lazy thinking. It is headline thinking. The world is not that simple. If the United States Treasury must continue issuing enormous quantities of debt, and if one major structural buyer becomes less willing to show up at previous prices, then long-term yields can remain higher than policy optimists expect. That alone changes everything. Stocks get valued differently. Mortgages get priced differently. Corporate credit gets priced differently. Private equity math changes. Real estate math changes. It is all one system. People want to carve markets into separate stories because separate stories feel easier to discuss. Housing over here, stocks over there, corporate debt somewhere else. The Fed at the center like a master switch. Reality is more connected than that. The long bond is not just another market. It is one of the giant hinges on which the whole valuation structure swings. If the 10-year stays elevated, mortgage rates do not magically drift back to 3% because someone on television wishes they would. That matters for affordability, that matters for refinancing, that matters for transaction volume, that matters for construction, that matters for bank balance sheets, that matters for the political temperature around housing. And the same thing applies to equities. The higher the baseline long-term rate, the less generous investors tend to be about paying enormous multiples for distant future cash flows. That does not mean every stock collapses. It means the valuation environment becomes stricter. And strict environments expose who was living on cheap money and who was living on real economics. That is always useful information, but it is not always pleasant information. Corporate credit feels the same pressure. When long-term financing remains expensive, the corporate world cannot behave the way it behaved when capital was nearly free. The boom years of easy refinancing, light debt service, casual issuance, and high multiple deal-making become harder to recreate. Private companies feel it. Public companies feel it. Merger activity feels it. Risk appetite feels it. A market can look fine in the headline indexes while the underlying cost of money keeps squeezing the real economy. That is one reason people experience the economy so differently from the way headlines describe it. They are living in the cost of capital, not in the press release. Now, I want to say something important about Japan itself, because it is tempting to tell this story as if Japan alone now controls American financial conditions. That would be just as lazy as pretending Japan does not matter at all. Japan is not the whole story. America's own debt issuance matters enormously. The Fed matters enormously. Inflation expectations matter. Growth expectations matter. Domestic institutions matter. Foreign central banks matter. But what Japan represents is one of the clearest examples of how the world can feel tight, even when people are told policy is easing. It is the cleanest illustration of why the market's most important risks are often located in the funding base rather than the slogan layer. I have spent a lifetime trying to understand where the real hinge sits, not where the crowd points, where the hinge sits. And more often than people like, the hinge is something dull, some relationship between rates, some structural buyer, some piece of plumbing, some market everybody calls technical, until it suddenly stops being technical and starts being the thing that explains why every asset in your life feels harder to own. That is Japan now. Not a dramatic villain, a structural force, a buyer whose behavior mattered so much for so long that the rest of the world forgot it was a variable. And when a variable gets mistaken for a permanent feature, trouble becomes much more likely. That is true in business and in life. Now, what should a serious investor do to this? Not panic, not all in on some theatrical macro bet, not chase every headline about Japan as if Tokyo has become the only city that matters. The right response is more disciplined than that. First, understand that easy. Money assumptions should no longer be granted the same confidence they were granted when Japan's zero-rate machine was fully in place and unquestioned. Second, understand that the broad market may still rise over time while the path becomes tighter, bumpier, and more dependent on genuine earnings power rather than on endless valuation forgiveness. Third, understand that mortgage rates, corporate financing, and long-duration asset prices may stay more stubborn than people trained by the last decade expect. That matters for how you underwrite every decision. I have never believed in making investment decisions from one macro story alone. That is not how I made my money. I made my money buying strong businesses at sensible prices and then letting time and economics do the work. I still believe that is the center of the discipline, but the backdrop matters. When the cost of money is misjudged, whole categories of assets can be misjudged for a long time. That is why the investor who understands the plumbing often has an advantage over the investor who only understands the headline. If the yen carry trade is no longer the endlessly cheap global Wi-Fi it once was, then a good many corners of the market may discover that the old liquidity environment was doing more work than anyone wanted to admit. That does not mean the world ends, it means the tide is changing. And when the tide changes, you begin to find out which boats were built for real water and which were mostly floating on a story. I have always preferred businesses that can survive stricter worlds. Pricing power, low leverage, strong balance sheets, real free cash flow, customer need rather than customer excitement. That preference becomes even more valuable when the hidden funding support under the global system weakens. I would rather own the business that can fund itself and pass through costs than the one that requires perfect capital markets to justify its valuation. That is true whether the pressure begins in Tokyo, Washington, or someplace the public cannot even find on a map. And if I were a household thinking about my mortgage, my next home purchase, or the affordability of life more generally, I would stop waiting for a fairy tale in which a few Fed cuts drag everything back to the old world. That world was built on conditions that are not obviously coming back. Cheap Japanese money was one of those conditions. The world that emerges from its withdrawal may still be investable, still prosperous in many ways, still full of opportunity. It is unlikely to feel as effortless. That is the point. When the background support weakens, effort matters more, security matters more, balance sheet strength matters more, selectivity matters more, and the investor or household that keeps pretending the old low-rate universe will simply reappear is likely to make poorer decisions than the one who accepts the new arithmetic early. There is another lesson hidden inside all this. The greatest risks are often not the ones people are talking about too much. They are the ones so boring that almost no one feels rewarded for studying them. A man who tells his friends he is worried about Japanese government bonds does not sound exciting. A man who talks about an AI bubble sounds current. But the quiet structural force may matter more than the loud speculative topic, because the structural force is what decides the cost of capital under the whole system. That is the difference between a symptom and a foundation. I am not telling you to ignore AI. I am telling you not to confuse the loudest topic with the deepest risk. The deepest risk is often the one hidden in plain sight. And if the world has spent decades leaning on Japanese capital as one of its cheapest sources of funding, then the repricing of that source is not some niche story. It is an everything story wearing a dull face. That is often how financial danger arrives, not through fireworks, through a support beam quietly moving out of place. And once you understand that, a great many puzzling things begin to make sense. Why mortgage rates do not fall the way the public expects. Why the stock market can feel unstable despite dovish talk. Why long-term yields remain stubborn. Why credit feels tighter than the policy commentary suggests. Why the old easy money reflexes keep failing to restore the old emotional comfort. The answer is not always Washington. Sometimes it begins in Tokyo. And if you want to survive and profit in markets over a long life, you must teach yourself to care about the quiet things before they become the loud ones. That has served me better than any dramatic headline ever did.